Welcome back for the final module of this workshop on plant diversity, climate change, and now we are jumping into conservation. So we've talked a lot about climate patterns, climate change, species distributions, and I just want to run through from all the work I've done with my colleagues, the things we've thought about, some of the strategies of how climate change is adapting, how conservation is adapting in response to climate change. By no means all of them. And there's other parts of the world and other ecosystems where other approaches are going to become really important. These are just some of the very high level things to be thinking about. So again, our last module on adapting conservation. So let's pause for a moment and think about what the traditional goals of conservation have been and the toolbox, like how do we go and do it? And this isn't an exhaustive list, but it covers a lot. One of our core goals has been conserving natural ecosystems. We can debate how natural, how impacted. Certainly, Native Americans being removed from the landscape has changed. Whatever they are, they're not what they were 1,000 years ago, and that's an important question. That goes back to my question about a baseline. But setting all that aside, conserving natural habitats through parks and protected areas is a key toolbox in conservation, with the goal of conserving entire ecosystems, certainly better than having them be suburbs. That there's at that level in terms of the importance of conservation, and a very important role in recreation. Reducing pollution and habitat loss and environmental degradation. You think of the Clean Water Act again, the Clean Air Act, those have been so important to conservation, environmental protection. Species level endangered species protection, and here the Endangered Species Act is key, and sometimes that's much more targeted, limiting development, regulating take for species that are fished or hunted, and maybe moving things around sometimes, or maybe even ex situ, like the condor story. So that's a very important and large category of goals and toolbox. And then finally partial, as we've really seen the potential to take what are degraded habitats and bring them back into being really vibrant places. So there's a partial toolbox of our core goals and the ways we accomplish them. Well, let's just ask this question. And it's to put a point on it, because it's not every species gets its own park. But if you think of Joshua Tree National Park, so here we have an important, beautiful national park, and it has an iconic species that's so important that we've named it for the species. And of course, we have Redwood National Park. We have Glacier National Park. That's going to lose its glaciers. It's just they're not a species. They're a geologic feature, but the same problem. What does it mean to us? It's almost more of an emotional question, but it just gets to the question that we set aside land for species. What if the species are gone? What does that mean about how we do conservation? And this is a very real one. This has been very well publicized, this research. Here we have, using the kinds of models I showed you, suitable habitat for Joshua Tree currently in the western end of the park. Then you get under a moderate degree of warming, and it's restricted increasingly to the mountains. You get to extreme warming, and you can barely see the spots that are left that are modeled to be suitable for Joshua Tree. Okay, Joshua Tree can be conserved outside the park. That's a whole set of strategies. But what should a park manager do? And in fact, in this case, the Joshua Tree National Park staff are very focused on thinking about these refugia and making sure those places are protected from fire, and let's just do what we can to protect those spots if those are going to be the last ones. But that doesn't mean it's enough, right? If they're the last ones, but they're still lost. So I don't have a specific answer, but I think it just makes it a pretty poignant question. I'm going to fairly quickly go through what I see as 5 key high-level strategies for conservation dealing with climate change. Some of these are things that are what we would call no regrets strategies. Like if climate change is a little or a lot, they're still good ideas. Some are much more specific and really depend on whether we see significant amount of climate change. The first one is what's come to be called conserve the stage. So this builds on everything I just said about landscapes, where, first of all, diverse landscapes harbor a greater diversity of species because they have different habitats. So that's a good idea, even in a stable climate, right, already. And a lot of our parks are very heterogeneous like this and have lots of different habitats. But the important point about the current thinking about conserve the stage is really the second point, which I spoke about in the last module, that a rugged landscape provides suitable sites that species can reach that are fairly close by. So it just makes for those lower movement distances or velocities as a pathway, or as a mechanism of resilience for these landscapes. So rugged landscapes are even more important in a changing climate than they might have been in thinking about our conservation strategies previously. The second one is to conserve refugia, and there's an enormous amount of attention to this. And it's about protecting places that are relatively stable as conditions change. Often we're looking for places that are stable and cool, or stable and moist, because we're in a period of climate change where things are getting warmer and drier. It's a interesting, but not it's an interesting thought exercise to say, what if things were getting cooler right now? What if we were going into an ice age and we were worried about conservation? We might reverse all our thinking. And it's an interesting thought process because it helps you clarify, our thinking when we think about how much does it matter that it's getting warmer versus if it was getting cooler. Right now it's getting warmer, it's getting drier. So wetlands are very important. But this question of stability, I think we need a lot more research, because there's places that, may be cooler, but they may not be stable. They could just be cool in the landscape, but they could be warming up just as much as others. So this idea of longer term and shorter term refugia is going to be very important as we think through the role of this strategy. A third strategy is connectivity. Now, this is another one that has always been important in conservation, but there's a real conceptual shift in how we're designing connectivity. In the past, connected landscapes were a priority mostly to allow for movement of large animals and maintaining gene flow and maintaining connectivity between different populations, so that when they were breeding, they're maintaining high genetic variability. Or connectivity so an animal could get to one place where it feeds and another place where it roosts, or summer to winter migration. So that was all connectivity for populations. And that's really characterized by the importance of wildlife crossings. This is an artist's rendering. It does not exist yet, but it is under construction. The world's largest wildlife crossing structure is being built over Highway 101 on the north side of the Santa Monica Mountains. And this is classic connectivity to allow for wildlife movement. But climate change conservationists are thinking about the problem at another scale, which is, how do we make sure to allow for species to migrate from where they live now to where they live in the future over decades, potentially? So not diurnal, not seasonal. And what this is leading to is a set of methods. And this is a study that was done. This is the Mayacamas Berryessa National Monument north of the San Francisco Bay Area. Some highlands in the middle. The gray are all protected areas. Actually, Pepperwood, where I have done some work and I spoke about in the last module, is right here. These are potential corridors where one could do some conservation work and protect them from development. But the red ones are deemed to be more valuable because they connect a warm location to a cool location. So they specifically provide connectivity that would allow species to get to cooler places, which they may need to do in order to survive in a future climate. So it's still connectivity, but it's a very different logic than the classic focus has been on wildlife connectivity. The good news potentially is that often the same corridors serve both purposes. And in fact, the Nature Conservancy did a very large analysis of connectivity in California. And what they really found is that conservation of riparian corridors is among the most valuable things we can do. And one reason is that rivers run up and downhill. So if we preserve riparian corridors, they're moist, which is good in terms of, say, thinking about refugia. They're often protected from development anyway, because we've been focused on water sources for a long time. And they create corridors that go uphill to cooler locations. So that is a simple rule of thumb and very consistent with a lot of conservation practice today, to be very protective of water sources and water courses across the landscape, streams and rivers. Another strategy, and this one maybe maybe this is peculiar to me. I haven't really run this by a lot of people to see how people think about it, but I think it's important to think about future winners and where they live now. Conservation biology has always been worried about the losers, what species might go extinct, for an incredibly good reason. Like, extinction is what we have been charged with preventing. That's what society needs us to do, is to prevent extinction, not lose species. But what interests me is that when we get into, I've picked out a species, black sage, here in California. Here we are up at the northern edge of the range of black sage. Here it is in a local park, in a little stand of it. Well, as it gets hotter, black sage is a very valuable native plant, valuable for pollinators. You know, it's part of an ecosystem that is an important native ecosystem to California. That's a really good potential future species to be more, that could be more common in this part of the landscape. So it's not threatened. We don't need to worry about it disappearing necessarily, but we wouldn't want to accidentally wipe out these populations of species that could be the future winners and the sources of a native vegetation in the future. So I think thinking about where these populations are when you're up at the northern edge, this is actually what we call the leading edge, the edge where species are expanding, and paying attention to conserving them is important. And often those will not be the traditional targets because they won't be species that are necessarily threatened, especially at that in those landscapes. And finally, the one that is attracting a lot of attention, but also attracts the most, well, maybe controversy in some cases, or at least heated discussion, and in fact deserves an enormous amount of attention, is what is the role of assisted migration? When should humans consciously and intentionally be collecting things, moving them, planting them, moving animals into new populations? There's two, I would say, you know, there's a lot to say about this. It is important to distinguish what's called assisted evolution from assisted migration. Assisted evolution would be bringing seeds, say, from a southern population to put into a northern population, so new genotypes are entering the population. It's still, you're not bringing a new species into a community, but you are mixing up the genotypes, and you're certainly potentially diluting the historic genetic variability that exists on that landscape. And some people really are concerned about that dilution because that genetic variability is an important, you know, product of the evolutionary past. In terms of restoration, certainly some conservationists advocate just putting more different genotypes into restoration populations and then let natural selection unfold, because natural selection is incredibly effective at figuring out which genotypes are best adapted. So it doesn't always mean that we need to know which ones are the best genotypes. Sometimes it's just putting more variability in situ and allowing natural selection, allowing natural ecological processes to unfold. Now, assisted migration beyond the range of a species is quite different, because now we're bringing new species into a community. This is, you can Google the Torreya Guardians. This is actually a rogue citizen effort. It's not particularly sanctioned by any agencies, I think. But it's a highly endangered species, a tiny little population. And citizen scientists or citizen conservationists have been collecting seed and planting it all across the eastern United States. And they plant it on private property or in botanic gardens. And of course, every botanic garden is an exercise in assisted migration. It's just we assume that we can control them and they're not going to escape, although things do escape from gardens, of course. And in fact, here they are. Here this tree is producing seeds all the way up in Ohio, from a tree that's last remaining natural population is in Florida. I'm someone who works a lot with trees. I think the one good thing that can be said for a lot of our trees is they're not often very invasive, just because they're slow growing. And it means that experimenting with assisted migration, when you know you can cut the tree down before it reproduces, you would be able to easily control its spread. That's a very different proposition than moving an insect or moving, you know, a very weedy plant, for example, that once you plant it, you might never be able to undo that effort. So those are just a few of the many considerations that need to go into discussions. And it's really going to have to be case by case. There's no right answer. It's really something that has to be thought through for each species, each context, each location, and thinking through pluses and minuses. And I'll end with just a few these words from the National Park Service. I won't unpack it, but this is a very powerful framework. The National Park Service spent a lot of time developing an internal framework for resource management in the face of climate change. And they came up with this approach: resist, accept, direct. The question that a manager asks when they're faced with a situation and climate is changing or environment is changing, do I try to resist this change? And a simple example might be like trying to water a tree in the face of a drought. Like, I'm going to resist this drought. I'm watering this tree. Do I accept the change? Which means to be very passive. Say, maybe our role in some places is just to be a witness to change. Like, why are we trying to counter it? Why are we trying to, oversee it or manage it? Maybe we just need to let nature take its course. Or do we try to direct change? And assisted migration would be a classic example. We're going to actively put plants in there that are the plants of the future. We're going to actively change the community to try to accelerate change towards the state that we believe, climate change may be driving us anyway. So I'll leave you with that. It's being used more and more in different frameworks. What's beautiful about it is it's a really simple way to start the question, and then it unfolds the many different options that are available, and thinking about them just in terms of this framework about how we think about how we want to play a role in shaping the future. And with that, I will wrap up this last module, and I want to thank you all for listening, and I enjoyed the opportunity. Thank you very much.